Well, hello there, and thanks for listening. And if you've been listening, welcome back. I'm continuing on. I'm continuing on in the book. And so if this is a one-off episode for you, I've been reading this book for, I don't know, a little bit over a year and a half, I don't know, a while, a long time. And the book that I've been reading is On the Path, an anthology on the Noble Eightfold Path drawn from the Pāli Canon. And this book was written by Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu, who is a well-known and respected American Buddhist monk, specifically the Theravāda tradition, the old-timey Buddhism. He is widely respected for his translations of Buddhist texts and his teachings on meditation and the Dhamma, and his works are deeply rooted, as I mentioned, in the Theravāda Buddhist tradition. And he emphasizes, as the Theravāda Buddhist tradition does, a direct, practical approach to the Buddhist teachings. And we, last week, and if, by the way, if you, the book is free. And if you just kind of, visit the comments section, you can find the link to the book. And thank you so much to Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu for putting this in the Creative Commons. And also selecting a license that allows me to read this book in podcast form with commentary, and to not have to pay to use it. I can, it's considered fair use as long as I don't profit, which I'm not. This is very much a part of my practice. And so I love this time I get to read the book and to talk about it. So last week we left off, if you are following along in the PDF, we left off at the bottom of page 202. And we're still in right view, and I'm probably going to need a couple more episodes to finish right view, to finish chapter 3. So we're right in the thick of it. And we began looking at the elements last week. And how Buddhism talks about the elements, I think, is best put in the subheading of this section: perceptions for inducing dispassion for the aggregates. I love that, inducing. It implies that we have some agency here, that we can actually cultivate this. We can induce it within ourselves. So last week, I talked about the earth property, talked about the liquid property, and today I'm beginning with the fire property. And this property is one that I know is an outstanding source of practice for me in my life. It's, yeah. At any rate, let's get into how Buddhism talks about fire, the property of fire. And what is the fire property? The fire property may be either internal or external. So again, if you haven't been listening, or if this is a one-off for you, then the way that this is phrased is exactly like liquid and earth were phrased. So they begin, again, this is kind of very lyrical in a way. It's, there's stanzas that repeat. There's a lot of repetition. And so you'll hear again, there's an emphasis on it's both internal and external, just like the liquid and earth properties. What is the internal fire property? Whatever internal belonging to oneself is fire, fiery, and sustained. That by which the body is warmed, aged, and consumed with fever, and that by which what is eaten, drunk, chewed, and savored gets properly digested, or whatever else internal within oneself is fire, fiery, and sustained. This is called the internal fire property. Now, both the internal fire property and the external fire property are simply fire property. And that should be seen as it actually is present with right discernment. This is not mine. This is not me. This is not myself. When one sees it thus, as it actually is, present with right discernment, one becomes disenchanted with the fire property and makes the mind dispassionate toward the fire property. Now there comes a time, friends, when the external fire property is provoked and consumes village, town, city, district, and country, and then coming to the edge of a green district, the edge of a road, the edge of a rocky district, to the water's edge, or to a lush, well-watered area, goes out from lack of sustenance. There comes a time when people try to make fire using a wing bone and tendon pairings. So when even in the external fire property, so vast, inconsistency will be discerned, destructibility will be discerned, a tendency to decay will be discerned, changeability will be discerned, then what if this short-lasting body sustained by clinging is I, or mine, or what I am? It has here only a no. So per the usual, I want to take a little bit of time to, double check a couple of references to make sure that I'm speaking to this accurately. And I'll be back to talk about it. And I'm very excited to be talking about fire today. So I'll try not to keep my commentary too long, but I make no guarantees. I'll be right back. Okay. And so I'm back. And it's several days later. And so it goes, right? But it's been great because since I started this a couple days ago, this section, I've had 2 incredibly difficult days of meditation. It seems so appropriate that I now get to come back and talk about the fire element or the fire property and what it is in a Buddhist context. And so the fire property internally, heat, temperature, agitation, anger, frustration. If you can ever consider a time in your life, or you can recall a time, or if you can't, but you feel so inclined to actually go do a little practice with yourself. If you've ever noticed what was happening in your body the last time that you were angry, furious, rage, what's happening in the body? If we sit with it, just all the feelings, and, if you begin to develop a meditation practice like this, maybe you don't meditate. Maybe you just begin to really take seriously practicing paying attention to what's happening right now when you're out in the world. And what you'll soon discover is that those feelings, hatred, anger, rage, they produce heat in the body. At least that's what it feels like for me when I'm sitting in it. I feel like I'm on fire. And remember what Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu began with at the beginning of this book in the introduction. It's the map to the fire escape. I'm not looking at it right now, but I believe that the chapter title is something like that. Fire. Because our mind's on fire. So what is fire? It's that anger, right? It's that fluttery, pulsing, right? In the body. Buddha's also talking about external fire property. When you really contemplate fire, whether it be internal or external, and you really begin to maybe start to practice with examining anger, rage, all of that, sitting with it, you begin to notice that it very much behaves like environmental fire. It takes no prisoners. It just devours everything in sight. And what's also interesting about fire, we had a horrible fire here in LA recently that kind of devastated an entire, small town. Well, small, relatively speaking, in Los Angeles, but a smaller community. And perhaps you yourself have experienced where you live a large fire that did an incredible amount of burning of the environment. And you also kind of notice that once it gets going, it just needs a little ember. In fact, that little ember can come from a mile away, and that little ember can keep it moving. It will feed it. It can even redirect it if the conditions are there. Sounds familiar, right? This is why in Buddhism, anger and hatred is, it's kind of a key critical emotional response to be examined and work with, and kind of really sort of very disciplined about working with. I know, speaking for myself, I know that I am disciplined in terms of, I know what my temperament is like, and I know that fire, that kind of is a very natural kind of, that is my temperament. It's always been my temperament. I can't remember a time as a child even when fire Was it my temperament? And I've talked about this before in this podcast, so I actually work with this a lot, just sitting in the fire, just sitting in the fire. So if you do, and you kind of contemplate it, you examine it, it can help you to detach from it, to unhook Shempa. So it cools it. It cools it down. It cools it down. And you begin to see that it's not who you are. It's a process. It's an internal property blasting through your body. In Buddhism, why you're experiencing it isn't really important. And I do want to talk about this a little bit today, because I know that in the West, Carl Jung, okay, so I think like a lot of people in the West who, maybe go to college or, whatever, they discover Carl Jung fairly early on. If you're interested in psychology, he's a pretty critical, pivotal, seminal, kind of guy in American psychology. And, Jungian psychology is, very popular in the West. And, if you listen to earlier episodes, where I talk about some of the different things that, brought me to, where I am today. I talk a little bit about the idea of shadow work, about how some of these kind of played out in my earlier days. I will say here, though, that Buddhism really takes quite a different view. As I've also spoken about in previous episodes, I went through a lot of therapy and was also very active in 12 steps for many years. So I had a lot of help in my relationship with food, growing up, and just, with things that were rough, to grapple with as a young person. But ultimately, for me, Buddhism makes more sense than Jung. I understand that Jung's kind of the import that he puts on storytelling, on the moving into your unconscious and creating characters or revisiting your inner child, and using story in this way, kind of using this storytelling to heal. And I think that can be profoundly effective, profoundly useful. I'm drawing a kind of a separator here, because the views are actually quite different. So Jung might refer to fire as, this darker, seamy underbelly, right? The shadow self, the shadow side. And, Jung would propose that we really need to look at it. We need to explore it. We need to examine it. And yeah, I'll just speak for myself. I know I did. And, again, I don't want to keep repeating it in every episode, but there's a lot of different things that I did to examine all of that. Buddhism isn't really interested in elaborating on the story of why, the me, mine, I is angry. The practice instead is just, this is heat. There is no me, my, I. It's phenomena arising. It's not mine, it's not me, it's not who, quote unquote, I am. It's not adding more layers on top of the narrative. This is fire, this is heat, this is rage, this is anger. So anyway, the aim is disidentification. Not feeding a story, but rather cooling, putting the fire out, practicing ways to work with it. And this doesn't mean denying it or pushing it down. It's the opposite of that, really. Just try meditation and you'll see what I mean. It's the exact opposite of pushing it down. You sit long enough and you can't hide from yourself. You will face yourself. You will. And what are you going to do? It's like that. Okay, so I'm going to move on from fire now. I think, kind of spent a goodly amount of time with it. And so finally we come to the wind property. And what is the wind property? The wind property may be either internal or external. What is the internal wind property? Whatever internal belonging to oneself is wind, windy and sustained. Upgoing winds, downgoing winds, winds in the stomach, winds in the intestines, winds that course through the body, in and out breathing, or whatever else internal within oneself is wind, windy, and sustained. This is called the internal wind property. Now, both the internal wind property and the external wind property are simply wind property. And that should be seen as it actually is, present with right discernment. This is not mine, this is not me, this is not myself. When one sees it thus, as it actually is present with right discernment, one becomes disenchanted with the wind property and makes the mind dispassionate toward the wind property. Now there comes a time, friends, when the external wind property is provoked and blows away village, town, city, district, and country. There comes a time when, in the last month of the hot season, people try to start a breeze with a fan or bellows, and even the grass at the fringe of a thatch roof doesn't stir. So when even in the external wind property so vast, inconsistency will be discerned, destructibility will be discerned, a tendency to decay will be discerned, changeability will be discerned, then what of this short-lasting body, sustained by clinging, is I, or mine, or what I am? It has here only a no. Now, if other people insult, malign, exasperate, and harass a monk who has discerned this, he discerns that a painful feeling, born of ear contact, has arisen within me. And that is dependent, not independent. Dependent on what? Dependent on contact. And he sees that contact is inconstant. Feeling is inconstant. Perception is inconstant. Consciousness is inconstant. His mind, with the wind property as its object / support, leaps up, grows confident, steadfast, and released. And if other people attack the monk in ways that are undesirable, displeasing, and disagreeable, through contact with fists, contact with stones, contact with sticks, or contact with knives, the monk discerns that this body is of such a nature, contacts with fists come, contact with stones come, contacts with sticks come, and contacts with knives come. Now the Blessed One has said in his exhortation of the simile of the saw, monks, even if bandits were to carve you up savagely, limb by limb, with a two-handled saw, he among you who let his heart get angered, even at that would not be doing my bidding. So my persistence will be aroused and untiring, my mindfulness established and unconfused, my body calm and unaroused, my mind concentrated and gathered into one. And now let contact with fists come to this body. Let contact with stones, with sticks, with knives come to this body. For this is how the Buddha's bidding is done. And if in the monk recollecting the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in this way, equanimity based on what is skillful is not established, he feels apprehensive at that and gives rise to a sense of urgency. It is a loss for me, not a gain, ill-gotten for me, not well-gotten, that when I recollect the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in this way, equanimity based on what is skillful is not established within me. Just as when a daughter-in-law, on seeing her father-in-law, feels apprehensive and gives rise to a sense of urgency to please him. In the same way, if in the monk recollecting the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in this way, equanimity based on what is skillful is not established, he feels apprehensive at that and gives rise to a sense of urgency. It is a loss for me, not a gain, ill-gotten for me, not well-gotten, that when I recollect the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in this way, equanimity based on what is skillful is not established within me. But if in the monk recollecting the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in this way, equanimity based on what is skillful is established, then he is gratified at that. And even to this extent, friends, the monk has accomplished a great deal. Wow. So that was the remaining section under wind. And so again, I want to consult a little bit, make sure I get this right. And when I come back, I'll address wind. So I'll be right back. So I'm really glad here that I consulted Robot for this. And this is when I absolutely wish that I had a teacher, because there's so much nuance here that I really don't know. I don't know what I'm saying. I don't know it well enough, these passages, to really be super, super crystal clear on the distinction. You know, in other words, in the last episode, you know, we were talking about earth and we were talking about liquid, and I was explaining a little bit about, you know, my response to things. And it could be that I was not nuanced enough there. So if so, my apologies. Yeah. Let me tell you a little bit about what Robot said. And yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And so it was really exciting for me to, you know, again, go into the weeds with this delightful book. And so getting a little help from my robot friend who's trained on Buddhist text. The wind property is anything that moves in or through you or presses down on you. And I hope that this is accurate. Again, I'm not a scholar, and so it seems to me that we're kind of working with all of these, perhaps, you know, if it reminds me again of really how nuanced all of this is, that you can really get into observing deeply, kind of noticing these experientially, the breath going in and out of the body, the rise and the fall of the belly. So this is movement, moving in us, moving through us, or pressure in the stomach, pressing down. Maybe a pulse in your veins, or stiffness or tension, or even gas. So internal properties, right? And then of course external, you know, would be wind, breezy wind, gusts of wind, storms. Once again, it's all the same practice as, you know, the Buddha repeats. And then, you know, the teachings really get into kind of homing in on how far we can work with this idea. And again, in reading this and, you know, kind of making sure that I have a really reliable and clear kind of layman's explanation of it, which I know I need. And I'll just say that, you know, this is how I absolutely know that I am not enlightened. And so then, you know, the Buddha really gets into kind of refining it even more. You know, that perhaps it's an insult directed at us that we hear, right? Last week I was, you know, comparing it to another property, but also perhaps this property would be more appropriate. You know, I heard an insult directed at me, and I forgot that it was nothing more than the wind property arising. Of course, there was the whole gestalt around why that phenomena was arising, which I talked about last week, actually, right? And yeah, that can be really helpful. You know, we just kind of talked about Jung a little bit. It certainly is for me. You know, we're all different. I don't know. I can't speak for anybody else. I'm not living in your experience, but you know, he suggests that, you know, we could be attacked, we could be struck, someone could throw stones at us or beat us with sticks. Somebody could knife us. It's just the wind property arising, movement in and through the body. Wow. So that is incredible to me. I can't fathom that. So the Buddha suggests that we should train, you know, that we're not going to be affected. That if we retort, if we lose our composure, they've gained, we've lost. We've lost our clarity. We've lost our self-mastery. And the insulter, whoever that might be, asserts power over us because they got a reaction out of us. So if we can remain unaffected, unaffected, patience, then that's a gain for us and a loss for them. So I certainly can't speak for you, but you know, I can find this quite challenging. And I have absolutely been known to put myself on a timeout. And it's, again, one of the, you know, many, many reasons why I do meditate every day, to help keep this stuff sorted out for me, you know, so I don't forget, because I'm really inclined to forget. I'm really inclined to forget that I'm nobody, It's phenomena arising. And I know that, again, the Buddha said this path would not be for everybody. I'm sure that, you know, not everybody wants to feel like they're nobody. And it could, to my view, it could mean, well, what's your definition of nobody? You know, because the definition, you know, Buddha's definition of nobody is really one that I really enjoy. when I get to experience it. I really enjoy it quite a bit, in fact. It's probably one of my favorite experiences when I get to have them. But I don't want to cling to them, at least not for me. That's a practice for me. So at any rate, yeah, really fascinating stuff here. And we're going to continue moving here because there are more properties to be looked at and explored. And if you're following along in the book, now at the top of page 204, and just a very brief little snippet on the space property. Friends, just as when in dependence on timber, vines, grass, and clay, space is enclosed and is gathered under the term house, in the same way, when space is enclosed in dependence on bones, tendons, muscle, and skin, it is gathered under the term form. So this little snippet that Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu put here, he follows it up immediately with dependent co-arising. And that really is, to my view, because he sets it up here when he's talking about the space property. He's letting us know that, the idea of dependent co-arising lives in all of this, but, also using an analogy here to kind of remind us that this also includes interaction with, right? Interaction with, what the ego calls the other, right? The interaction with fire and water and earth and liquid and space as it arises, phenomena arising, that it's dependent. So our experience of these properties is dependent on our ricocheting or, kind of gently bumping or, absorbing, right? The phenomena in other human form, an animal, right? It's all kind of, we're all part of how the sausage is made. We are producing it together. I think in the United States, we can see it in real time. The angrier people get, the more they vilify people they disagree with, the more that they vilify others so much and double down on their hatred so much that the other now no longer becomes human. No longer becomes an animal even, maybe just becomes some kind of story that they've got going in their mind, right? And you get that fire, you get that heat, you get that going long enough, fast enough, boom, you might take a life. You might lose your life. So, yeah, we're now getting into dependent co-arising. Now, if internally the I is intact, but externally forms do not come into range, nor is there a corresponding engagement, then there is no appearing of the corresponding type of consciousness. If internally the I is intact, and externally forms come into range, but there is no corresponding engagement, then there is no appearing of the corresponding type of consciousness. But when internally the I is intact, and externally forms come into range, and there is a corresponding engagement, then there is the appearing of the corresponding type of consciousness. The form of what has thus come to be is gathered under the form clinging aggregate. The feeling of what has thus come to be is gathered under the feeling clinging aggregate. The perception of what has thus come to be is gathered under the perception clinging aggregate. The fabrications of what has thus come to be are gathered under the fabrication clinging aggregate. The consciousness of what has thus come to be is gathered under the consciousness clinging aggregate. One discerns, this, it seems, is how there is the gathering, meeting, and convergence of these 5 clinging aggregates. Now the Blessed One has said, whoever sees dependent co-arising sees the Dhamma. Whoever sees the Dhamma sees dependent co-arising. And these things, the 5 clinging aggregates, are dependently co-arisen. Any desire, embracing, grasping, and holding on to these 5 clinging aggregates is the origination of stress. Any subduing of desire and passion, any abandoning of desire and passion for these 5 clinging aggregates is the cessation of stress. And even to this extent, friends, the the monk has accomplished a great deal. Now, if internally the ear is intact, and then he's got ellipses, so I think he's just kind of laying these out again to remind us, tie us back, anchor us back in the 5 aggregates. Now, if internally the ear is intact, and then ellipses. Now, if internally the nose is intact, ellipses. Now, if internally the tongue is intact, ellipses. Now, if internally the body is intact, ellipses. Now, if internally the intellect is intact, but externally ideas do not come into range, nor is there a corresponding engagement, then there is no appearing of the corresponding type of consciousness. If internally the intellect is intact and externally ideas come into range, but there is no corresponding engagement, then there is no appearing of the corresponding type of consciousness. But when internally the intellect is intact and externally ideas come into range and there is a corresponding engagement, then there is the appearing of the corresponding type of consciousness. The form of what has thus come to be is gathered under the form clinging aggregate. The feeling of what has thus come to be is gathered under the feeling clinging aggregate. The perception of what has thus come to be is gathered under the perception clinging aggregate. The fabrications of what has thus come to be are gathered under the fabrication clinging aggregate. The consciousness of what has thus come to be is gathered under the consciousness clinging aggregate. One discerns. This, it seems, is how there is the gathering, meeting, and convergence of these 5 clinging aggregates. Now, the Blessed One has said, whoever sees dependent co-arising sees the Dhamma. Whoever sees the Dhamma sees dependent co-arising. And these things, the 5 clinging aggregates, are dependently co-arisen. Any desire, embracing, grasping, and holding onto these 5 clinging aggregates is the origination of stress. Any subduing of desire and passion, any abandoning of desire and passion for these 5 clinging aggregates is the cessation of stress. And even to this extent, friends, the monk has accomplished a great deal. That is what Venerable Sariputta said. Gratified, the monks delighted in Venerable Sariputta's words. And that comes from MN 28. And here, Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu has provided a note section. And I'll read that for you before I actually go and get the help I need to really make sure that I'm doing my best, my personal best anywho, to bring this down to where most of us live, right here in layman's land, if you're also a practicing Buddhist. Or just even if you're not a Buddhist and you're just interested in understanding, like penetrating these ideas. So number 1, says Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu, the compilers of the Pāli Canon used a common theory to explain the physics of heat and motion, meteorology, and the etiology of diseases. That theory centered on the concept of dhatu, property or potential. The physical properties presented in this theory were 4, those of earth, solidity, liquid, fire, and wind, or motion. 3 of them, liquid, fire, and wind, were viewed as potentially active when they were aggravated, agitated, or provoked. The Pāli term here, pakupati, was used also on the psychological level. Lever, that's an interesting Freudian slip there, where it meant angered or upset, right? We talked about this earlier. They acted as the underlying causes for activity in nature. For more on this topic, he says, see the mind like fire unbound in chapter 2. And yes, we talked about that. And again, if you're this is a one-off episode for you and you're not reading the book, you're listening, I encourage you to go back to much earlier episodes where you can listen to what Bhikkhu has to say, Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu has to say here, or how he talks about this. Okay, number 2, and this he says he's pulling from AN 7:46, quoted in the Mind Like Fire Unbound, cites a wing bone and tendon pairings as examples of items that will not catch fire. See, I was going to look that up, and now I don't have to. So, how cool is that to bring in a metaphor of something that cannot be set ablaze, something that is flame retardant. I can't tell you how often that I have wished that my internals were fire retardant. I can tell you that 30, well, yeah, not 30, but yeah, if I'm being really honest, not 30, certainly not 30 with meditation, but a good 25 years, I've absolutely tried to cultivate becoming more internally fire retardant, right? But I love this idea, that here is this property, or this apparently in the culture, or whatever's going on here, this concept of the wing bone and tendon pairing, it can't be set on fire. So yeah, what a perfect metaphor. Perhaps the passage was meant as a comical parody of someone who, having seen another person start fire with a fire stick, tried to imitate that person without understanding the basic principle involved. Wow, isn't that fascinating? Well, I can tell you right now that I certainly want to know more about that, but I'll spare you that rabbit hole. Yeah, you can do that on your own as well. I'm sure you're capable. If you used a fire stick and wood shavings, you would get fire. If you used a wing bone instead of a fire stick and tendon pairings instead of wood shavings, you wouldn't. So I love that, and definitely want to read a little bit more about that. So number 3, this statement has not been traced in any other part of the extant Pāli Canon. Well, that's interesting too. So he's letting us know that this suggestion that perhaps it was a parody hasn't been verified anywhere else in the canon. So he's just letting us know that. Number 4, he just says CSN 12:2. Again, this is really where it would help if you're looking at the text, because these are footnotes. And then 5 is, although the fourth noble truth, the path of practice leading to the cessation of stress, is not explicitly mentioned in this discussion, it is implicit as the path of practice leading to the subduing of desire and passion, the abandoning of desire and passion for the 5 clinging aggregates, he says. Okay. So there we go. So before I get into the next sutta, Sutta 116 at the bottom of page 206, I definitely want to go back and really look at this beautiful and very kind of long kind of introduction here to the dependent co-arising before we actually get into the suttas supporting Buddhist concept of dependent co-arising. So I'll be right back. All right. So I'll do my best here. And of course, more will be revealed as we go through the suttas that support dependent co-arising. But thinking about, using the robot to penetrate the text, given what it's been trained on, I'll kind of do my best to translate all of that and see how it goes. So, in the text, the Buddha is referring to different aspects of form, right? Like, now if internally the ear is intact, now if internally the nose, right? Now if internally the eyes, the body, he goes on. That repetition that we're all pretty used to now. He's repeating it for each of these sense gates, if you will, and beyond, to reiterate that this idea of dependent co-arising applies to all of them in the same way. So, seeing, for instance, you're seeing something. You're seeing something in your news feed. You're seeing something happen between two people. You're seeing anything at all with your eyes, and perhaps you cannot see with your eyes. And here's where I would be so interested if there's anybody out there, I don't know what Buddha had to say about that because I'm not a scholar. And so I don't know, I don't have a really huge body of text to pull from like somebody who's, monastic would. But I'm sure, that there's much to be said about that phenomena arising. But I'll use seeing in the eye just for practical purposes. But again, remember that this applies to all things that arise. That it's not anything more than phenomena arising. It's your eye seeing form, something, right? Some form, and your conscious awareness of perceiving that form. It's that relationship. So it is with perception, feeling. We see some form. We have awareness of it. We're cognating, either overtly or covertly about it, processing it. And oftentimes unconsciously or subconsciously, and if we practice, then hopefully more and more consciously, we recognize feelings, perceptions, and the stories that we tell about it. We recognize them for what they are, phenomena arising. So it's a package deal of experience. It's all contingent upon one another to create what we call reality. And the stress that the Buddha talks about comes from hanging on to any of that as if it was going to last forever, something that is constantly, dependently co-arising. And when you recognize that it's constantly and changing, all of it is constantly changing, there's a lot of freedom, that can come from that, from being nobody. That's what nobody means in Buddhism, to my view. That's what non-self means. So your experience, it's built. It's built by outside experiences. It's built by inside experiences. You have agency, regardless. It's all conditional. It's not me. It can all be worked with. Everything is workable. Start loving on yourself. It's all workable. Okay, so I'm going to transition now and kind of get into the suttas that Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu has compiled to support the idea of dependent co-arising in Buddhism. So let's get into it. And maybe I'll just briefly say before we move on that, there are a lot of really, reasonable suspicions to have around this idea, but what about objective reality? And, to my view, again, going back to the beginning of reading these properties, the Buddha reminds us over and over and over again, there are internal and there are external objects, or phenomena to each of these properties. And so, to my understanding of the early text, Buddha was not denying that objective reality exists. What he's saying is that objective reality is wholly mediated through dependent co-arising. That's his argument. It's a very specific argument that he's making here. All right, so on the bottom of page 206, he begins us with Sutta 116. Monks. A monk who is skilled in 7 bases and has 3 modes of investigation is fulfilled and fully accomplished in this Dhamma and Vinaya, the ultimate person. And how is a monk skilled in 7 bases? There's the case where a monk discerns form, the origination of form, the cessation of form, the path of practice leading to the cessation of form. He discerns the allure of form, the drawback of form, and the escape from form. He discerns feeling, and then he has an ellipses. He discerns perception, ellipses. He discerns fabrications, ellipses. Again, a word you'll hear repeatedly in Buddhism, and so you've already heard repeatedly in this text, what fabrication means in Buddhism. He discerns consciousness, the origination of consciousness, the cessation of consciousness, the path of practice leading to the cessation of consciousness. He discerns the allure of consciousness, the drawback of consciousness, and the escape from consciousness. And what is form? The 4 great existence: the earth property, the liquid property, the fire property, and the wind property, and the form derived from them. This is called form. From the origination of nutriment comes the origination of form. From the cessation of nutriment comes the cessation of form. And just this Noble Eightfold Path is the path of practice leading to the cessation of form, i.e. right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The fact that pleasure and happiness arise in dependence on form. That is the allure of form. The fact that form is inconstant, stressful, subject to change. That is the drawback of form. The subduing of desire passion. And here he has desire-passion as if it was a word, right? The subduing of desire-passion for form. The abandoning of desire-passion for form. That is the escape from form. And then he has an ellipses. So he goes on. And what is feeling? These 6 bodies of feeling. Feeling born of eye contact, feeling born of ear contact, feeling born of nose contact, feeling born of tongue contact, feeling born of body contact, feeling born of intellect contact. This is called feeling. From the origination of contact comes the origination of feeling. From the cessation of contact comes the cessation of feeling. And just this Noble Eightfold Path is the path of practice leading to the cessation of feeling. And then he's got an ellipses, so there's more, but he's putting all of this in context for us. The fact that pleasure and happiness arise in dependence on feeling, that is the allure of feeling. The fact that feeling is inconstant, stressful, subject to change, that is the drawback of feeling. The subduing of desire-passion for feeling, the abandoning of desire-passion for feeling, that is the escape from feeling. And he has an ellipses. And what is perception? These 6 bodies of perception. Perception of form, perception of sound, perception of smell, perception of taste, perception of tactile sensation, perception of ideas. This is called perception. From the origination of contact comes the origination of perception. From the cessation of contact comes the cessation of perception. And just this Noble Eightfold Path is the path of practice leading to the cessation of perception. Again, he has an ellipses. The fact that pleasure and happiness arise in dependence on perception, that is the allure of perception. The fact that perception is inconstant, stressful, subject to change, that is the drawback of perception. The subduing of desire-passion for perception, the abandoning of desire-passion for perception, that is the escape from perception. And so now he gets to it. Well, not that that wasn't it. And what are fabrications? And so, he's talked about this before, past episodes, if you want to hear more about fabrications, if you're not reading, but listening. These 6 bodies of intention. So again, let me just start that sentence again to remind the context. And what are fabrications? These 6 bodies of intention. Intention with regard to form. Intention with regard to sound. Intention with regard to smell. Intention with regard to taste. Intention with regard to tactile sensation. Intention with regard to ideas. These are called fabrications. Fabrications equals attachment to ideas. I'm actually making that note for myself, and you'll find out why pretty soon. From the origination of contact comes the origination of fabrications. And just this Noble Eightfold Path is the path of practice leading to the cessation of fabrications. The fact that pleasure and happiness arise in dependence on fabrications, that is the allure of fabrications. The fact that fabrications are inconstant, stressful, subject to change, that is the drawback of fabrications. The subduing of desire-passion for fabrications, the abandoning of desire-passion for fabrications, that is the escape from fabrications. And again, he has an ellipses. And so one by one, we're going through them, right? Once again, applying that repetition. And what is consciousness? These 6 bodies of consciousness: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, intellect consciousness. This is called consciousness. From the origination of name and form comes the origination of consciousness. From the cessation of name and form comes the cessation of consciousness. And just this Noble Eightfold Path is the path of practice leading to the cessation of consciousness, i.e. right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. The fact that pleasure and happiness arise in dependence on consciousness, that is the allure of consciousness. The fact that consciousness is inconstant, stressful, subject to change, that is the drawback of consciousness. The subduing of desire-passion for consciousness, the abandoning of desire-passion for consciousness, that is the escape from consciousness. This is how a monk is skilled in 7 bases. And how does a monk have 3 modes of investigation? There's the case where a monk investigates in terms of properties, investigates in terms of sense media, investigates in terms of dependent co-arising. This is how a monk has 3 modes of investigation. A monk who is skilled in 7 bases and has 3 modes of investigation is fulfilled and fully accomplished in this Dhamma and Vinaya, dash what Buddha calls here, it says, the ultimate person. And this comes from SN 22:57. So again, wow, so much richness here. And again, I want to get into the weeds with this and do my best to capture it for lay people, or people who are just interested in what this old-timey Buddhism had to say about such matters. I'll be right back. Okay, so quite a bit of time has gone by. Turned into paper, other things in real life. Not that this isn't real life, mind you. And I also took some time to, once again, ask Robot to penetrate this text, to help me talk about it in a way that not only, hopefully, you might better understand, but that I might better understand as well. So, yeah. And there's a whole lot here. And so I think what I'll do is I'll just take a look at, I'll try to talk about this sutta, looking at it through the lens of how the sutta began, wherein he says, a monk who is skilled in 7 bases and has 3 modes of investigation is fulfilled and fully accomplished, right? The ultimate person. So what are these 7 bases? And what are these 3 modes? And again, really kind of getting into the weeds, with this book is great. I think if anyone's ever tried to explain, I'll speak for myself. So I've taught meditation off and on over the years, and I find teaching it this way, the traditional Buddhist method, it's difficult to explain. I think it's difficult to explain because I don't know that you can impart a whole lot to anyone via explanation, which, the Buddha also tells us, so, I'll kind of get into what Robot says and what I remember from, being much more involved directly with the teachings, and hope to be again soon when I find a Sangha, as I've talked about, but also just kind of try to talk about this as it arises in my own meditation. It's, as I researched this particular sutta, this aligns so well with, obviously, with how I was instructed and how to meditate, so many years ago, and how I still meditate today. Nothing's really changed for me. I've tried other things, I've definitely experimented, if you listen to earlier episodes, I talk about, all of the different, the different things that I've explored in my life so far, but kind of settled, on Buddhism for myself, about 25 years ago or so. So anywho, let me get into this, right? This 7 bases and the 3 modes of investigation. So I love the way, first of all, I always ask Robot to, usually the prompt that I begin with is penetrate this text. And there's also kind of a running template that I have with Robot, that I want cited references from where I can locate it in the canon, and, translations of the canon, and also, lay person's language, practical, something that both myself and you and all of us, if you're interested in any of this, can actually apply to your own life or relate to your own life in some way. And so I love here what Robot says as a way to kind of think about the 7 bases and the 3 modes of investigation. Robot says, the 7 bases are what you investigate. So when you're investigating, so in other words, and again, I don't want to talk about this too much now because I want it to be fresh, and I know that I'm not a scholar, and I want to get to it when we get to it. Right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness. But I'll just say this, that in terms of meditation, there are many different kinds of meditation in Buddhism. I'll just say that how I use the 7 bases very practically, just in a day-to-day, daily 40-minute meditation, no sound other than, ambient sound, sometimes, eyes usually closed, sometimes softly focused and open, but the mind on fire, right? And so what are the 7 bases that I can investigate? And I have to investigate them if I want to keep my butt on the cushion. Otherwise, I'll go mad. Go ahead, try it out, and you'll see what I mean. And then the three modes are how we investigate them. And so let's get into this. Let's get into how Robot addressed this particular sutta. So the 7 bases. Form. We've already talked so much about this, right? Getting into the aggregates. So form, the physical phenomena that we've been talking about, those elements, those internal and external properties of, water or liquid, fire, air, earth, space. Feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or painful is the word that, Robot gave, but I don't think that really is quite accurate. Painful is not really, it's, from my understanding, it's pleasant, unpleasant. So not necessarily painful, just unpleasant or neutral. Another base is the base of perception. So we, again, going back to, we see something, we cognate, we have experience consciousness around it. We form stories and, et cetera, make connections around it. And we, therein quickly, we perceive, we experience perception, the perception of the object. And so we recognize it, right? We label it. This is that. You might notice if you have ever, maybe been trained in meditation in a Buddhist way, if you are receiving instruction from someone who's, a Buddhist in the kind of traditional Buddhist meditation way, then many teachers will talk about a very helpful technique, the idea of when you're learning how to meditate, when you're learning how to stay on your cushion without checking out, without going numb, falling asleep, or just escaping, right? Whether internally or externally, just fleeing. There are lots of little tricks. And, one here is you can use your perception to help by labeling the thoughts and the experiences, the feelings, all of this, all of the aggregates, all of the fabricated conditioning we experience. You can label it as it arises. Kind of teaching yourself, training the mind that, okay, now this is happening. Now this, now that, now this, now that. And so this can be very helpful. 4, fabrications, intentions, mental formations. This is huge here. Mental formations. I said earlier that I wanted to make a note. And of course, now I can't find the note that I made, but I'll just say that, I live in the United States, and, I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time talking about, some of the recent news in the United States and, the assassination of a political figure, not, I shouldn't say political figure, important correction, a political podcaster. Certainly not the first time this has happened. Both on the left and the right politically, there's been political violence. It happens in the US. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I feel like there's already a lot of airtime covering that. But I do want to say about all of that in general, the where one's headspace would need to be to take a life in general. Sometimes where the headspace is lost in mental illness. And that's a kind of fabrication, isn't it? If you're suffering with perhaps something like schizophrenia, well, you're really just not living in the same reality as the rest of us, whatever that means, right? There's a whole level there of fabrication, of form, feeling, perception, consciousness, nutriment, etc. There's a veil, a heavy, heavy veil that's pulled tight against discernment and agency. I get why there would be a real strong pushback against any kind of philosophy or theology that doesn't account for those humans. And in Buddhism, I don't, as discussed earlier, the Buddha said, hey, the most we can hope for is to be born in human form. So, right, it's not that I don't appreciate and think that, I think humans matter, but I don't think they matter as much as maybe Judeo-Christians do. And to that degree, I don't know what the Buddha said about it because I'm not a scholar, but I would like for myself to acknowledge that no, not everybody does have any agency, you know. I think about the man who stabbed a young woman on the train in North Carolina, in the country where I live. And of course it was quickly turned into political fodder. I just want to say that happens, you know, that happens, and that it's devastating that a life is snuffed out, and that there is a life that can take a life, that somehow they don't have access to a different possible framework. Or perhaps, again, you know, I'm not a psychiatrist. You know, I've never worked with a mentally ill population before to that degree. You know, my maternal grandmother was bipolar, and observing her as a young girl and a young woman was, you know, it was strange and sad, and quite frankly, I admit it, kind of fascinating. Just trying to understand, you know, what is the mind doing? What is the mind doing? Anyway, I'm going way off the rails here, but fabrications, intentions, and mental formations. So there's a lot of media coming out now where I live today, in the last few hours, in fact, even in the last few minutes, you know, because it's been just blanketed across the media in the United States, or at least in the market that I live in. But, you know, I get a lot of my news from different sources online, so, you know, it's not all local. And this didn't happen locally, you know, it didn't happen in the city that I live in. But there's a lot of stuff coming out now about this young man who shot this political podcaster, Charlie Kirk. You know, he's a young guy, he's 22 years old. And there's a lot going on, a lot of information is coming out. But I think the thing that is of most interest to me, and I think, you know, all of it makes me sad. Anytime anyone takes a life, and anytime anyone celebrates the taking of a life, I mean, all of that is, I don't know, Mara. You know, that's reflecting what the Buddha said it would reflect, you know. But, you know, I think because I'm studying media psychology, I think I'm particularly interested in this young man's, you know, his digital social reality on Discord and these other groups, which I'm looking forward to finding out more about. That was his nourishment. You know, the Buddha uses the word nourishment. What's nourishing form? What's nourishing feeling? What's nourishing perception? So nourishment. What is nourishment? Food. It's feed. What is food? Food is that stuff that we take in to sustain life, if it's actual food. But here, you know, in Buddha wisdom here, he's talking about a different kind of nourishment. You know, he's talking about the mental formations that can be cultivated and also become entrenched based on the nourishment that we are subjected to or engage in. And when addiction is on the line, which quite frankly, I think most of you are addicted to your phones, to being online. Most of us are, right? We're kind of addicted. Not everybody. So if this doesn't resonate, right on. And if you're not liking the word addiction, okay, I'm going to keep using it though, because, well, you know, I would recommend you look up the definition of addiction, and then get really honest with yourself about whether or not you think your social media and portable phone use falls within that categorical definition of addiction. Or maybe your kids, does your kids fall into that categorical definition of addiction? Addiction, right? Mental formations. We create mental formations around all nourishment. Just thinking about how this young man, you know, whose life was just beginning, you know, 22, just as so many psychologists have been warning for so long, you know, he became lost. You know, I was talking to someone the other day, you know, there's a show in the United States. Well, I don't know. I'm sure it's international at this point, but you know, the Stranger Things. And, you know, she said, yeah, it's just like it's the upside down world. And yeah, you know, I would say that idea applies here. The upside down world, you know, you get caught up in the fomenting nourishment of some of the online discourse, and we feed it and feed it and feed it and feed it and ingest more and more and more and more of it. And we can even become quite addicted to the feeling that it produces in us We can feel actually quite kind of turned on by celebrating someone's death, because we can foment ourselves into self-righteousness around it. So then it's okay, right? Because they're evil. They're a non-thing. Lest you forget history. Lest you forget that history repeats itself. So anywho, yeah, it's been on my mind, and I probably should get going here and keep on going. Consciousness. And that's the knowing at each sense base. So the knowing, the recognizing of the experience, right? And to me, this is, when we'll, much later in the book, when we get into right mindfulness, I think this idea right here, this base of consciousness is a really critical starting point for developing a mindfulness practice. It's kind of the first thing that we have to learn how to do, is can we know it when it's happening, right? Most of us just kind of go through life on autopilot. We may not really, we may not notice or even be able to necessarily find our habits of thought, right? What we're thinking about, maybe what we're thinking about repeatedly, unless you actually, make a point of it. Maybe you do some Jungian, some depth psychology or some, shadow work. Maybe that's the path, that you're finding fruitful. Or maybe you're doing it, through a religious valence, and that speaks to you through, anyway, I don't want to speak out of my knowledge here, but this idea of consciousness and, how conscious are we in any given moment? And then we just talked about the nutriment, both literal food and, the contact, the intention, the consciousness. We can be easily influenced if we don't train in mastering the relationship between our mind and its influences, so. And then, then it kind of gets into the three modes of investigation, so Buddha's saying, okay, well, these are the things that need to be investigated. These are the things that we need to look at. And these are the ways that he recommended that we do it. And he recommended that we do these three methods for each of the bases to help us to understand how we are no one and nobody and why that's not so bad. At least that's my take on it. So the three modes of investigation, origination. So asking yourself, so, well, where does this come from? Flash. You're angry, flash. You're terrified, flash. You're hysterically crying, flash. Where is this coming from? Maybe you're engaging in a behavior, not even quite sure why you're doing it, but you caught yourself. Maybe eating more than you wanted to and way beyond being hungry. Or any other behavior that maybe logically doesn't make sense, right? Maybe you catch yourself. Not to punish yourself. That's the antithesis of Buddhism. That has nothing to do with Buddhism. Guilt and shame, those don't belong in Buddhism. With interest. What is this? Where did this come from? This feeling, kind of sourcing it, seeing it for what it is. And then two, another thing to contemplate around each base would be cessation. And so when those feelings go away, when they pass, while you're watching them, while you're observing them, what happens? The first piece of good news, and I realized, okay, that meditation is not for everyone, and I would argue that Buddhism isn't for everyone. It's not a wholly solitary path, absolutely not. I mean, Sangha is one of the three jewels, the three legs on the stool, but it is a much more solitary path than certainly any Judeo-Christian religion would be. So I realized that I don't mean to say this flippantly, okay? And I've already mentioned, I've had some pretty profound experiences in meditation. Again, I kind of talked about my youth and my experiences with hallucinogens when I was a much younger person. And no, none of this is to be trifled with. None of this is to be trifled with as if it's insignificant or some plaything. And I certainly don't mean to come across that way at all when I say that. Often we'll discover that we're still alive, we're not dead. So the fear didn't kill us. The hunger didn't kill us. The hot, fiery property of desire and longing, it'll fizzle out, it'll fade out. And we're able to look at those things within ourselves if and when we're ready. Again, lose the guilt, lose the shame. That's just not really, it's not aligned with Buddhism. And then number 3, the allure, the drawback, or you'll hear, right, again in this sutta, escape. You hear the word escape repeated, escape, asara, adinava, nisarana. And again, I don't know how well I'm doing, but I'm trying to learn the Pāli words for these, because this is where it comes from, respect. So here, what we're contemplating with each form or base form or property, whatever you want to do there, what is seductive about it? If we're hanging on to it, what's so desirable that we want to hang on to it? And where I think this can get really, really interesting is with addiction. And when I think about, my own relationship to addiction, and, again, I've talked a lot about, food addiction and, how I work with that and had a lot of healing and recovery from that. But this is a big one here. What is seductive? Once again, going back to this young man who was really, really active in a lot of online social organizations and really involved, right? So nourishment. And then of course, because it's dependent, it's co-arising, right? So we're communicating with each other. We don't have any nonverbal communication happening, and so that's psychologically really kind of taking a lot out of all of this, making it feel and seem much more esoteric, much more not real, much more some reality show, some weird narrative that I've thought about and talked about in some faceless, nameless, digital void. And so you keep going back. And why do you keep going back? What's the allure? Belonging, a feeling of a sense of community. Humans are desperate for it. It's kind of one of the things that the Buddha warned about. Clinging to the need for belonging. Look what it does. Wouldn't it be more interesting to cultivate kind of some inner mastery so that you have a natural confidence that comes with cultivating this internal mastery. And with that confidence comes natural discernment, just a natural discernment. Because that escape, right, that allure, that drawback, that feeding, clinging, all of that, it can, yes. And the Buddha noticed this, right? This is kind of, again, Hermann Hesse, that kind of the origin story of Buddha leaving his family. Yes, that's true. And his wife, and you're absolutely. So I'm not saying he, by no means and measure, but it's the whole origin story here that, it can be very, very, very sensually seductive. So much so that we forget ourselves. We forget our humanity, our compassion. I didn't really bring it up earlier, and talking about the properties and talking about how I work with fire. And I think what I worry more about right now is not that people are fiery, is that people are numb. Because the fire that comes out of numbness, when that numbness breaks, is really dangerous. And I kind of feel like we're seeing that now, at least in the country that I live in. And yeah, I don't know what to make of all of it, other than to my view, and to Buddhism's view. And we train in compassion, and we train in dissolving hatred in our hearts. And I continue to be stunned at how my heart has been softened throughout my life, not just through Buddhism, as I mentioned, but through the help of a lot of other things. 12 steps for a very long time, therapy, people in my life, just softening the heart. And I also get why, some people will never soften their heart. They'll die with their heart hard. I know my dad did, and I love him so much, and it's not his fault. It's he got stuck somewhere along the way. That's what happens to us. We get stuck unless we train, or we have a support system, right? Again, Buddhism, not for everyone, and depending on your nature, I guess, or whatever, the community and the fellowship that's found in 12-step models or in church, right? Even if perhaps you yourself are more secular or you struggle with, and again, I know this is a complex subject for people. Religion is very salient psychologically for all humans, really. I would say even atheists, we can get quite interestingly provoked around our beliefs or what we claim to not believe in this regard, and I'm including myself in this equation for sure. I've gone off the rails per the usual. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about this here as we were getting to get into dependent co-arising. And we have quite a long way to go here with all of this still. So I'm just going to do one more sutta just to try to get a little bit further along. It is a long one, so I'll leave us with Sutta 117. Suppose, monks, that there were a beverage in a bronze cup, consummate in its color, consummate in its smell, consummate in its flavor, but mixed with poison. And a man were to come along, scorched from the heat, oppressed by heat, exhausted, trembling, and thirsty. They would say to him, "Here, my good man, is a beverage for you in a bronze cup, consummate in its color, consummate in its smell, consummate in its flavor, but mixed with poison. Drink it, if you want. Having been drunk, it will please you with its color, smell, and flavor. But having drunk it, you will, from that cause, meet with death or death-like suffering." He would drink it quickly without reflection. He wouldn't reject it. And from that cause, he would meet with death or death-like suffering. In the same way, monks, any contemplatives and Brahmins in the past, future, present, who see whatever seems endearing and alluring in terms of the world as constant, as pleasant, as self, as freedom from disease, as safety, make craving grow, as safety, make craving grow. Those who make craving grow, make acquisition grow. Those who make acquisition grow, make stress grow. Those who make stress grow are not released from birth, aging, death, sorrows, lamentations, pain, distresses, and despairs. They are not released, I tell you, from suffering and stress. And then he has an ellipses here. And he continues on. Suppose, monks, that there were a beverage in a bronze cup, consummate in its color, consummate in its smell, consummate in its flavor, but mixed with poison. And a man were to come along, scorched from the heat, oppressed by heat, exhausted, trembling, and thirsty. They would say to him, "Here, my good man, is a beverage for you in a bronze cup, consummate in its color, consummate in its smell, consummate in its flavor, but mixed with poison. Drink it, if you want. Having been drunk, it will please you with its color, smell, and flavor. But having drunk it, you will, from that cause, meet with death or death-like suffering." The thought would occur to that man, it's possible to subdue this thirst of mine with water, with whey, with salted porridge, or with bean broth. I certainly shouldn't drink that, which would be for my long-term harm and suffering. Having reflected on that beverage in the bronze cup, he wouldn't drink it. He would reject it. And so from that cause, he would not meet with death or death-like suffering. In the same way, monks, any contemplatives and Brahmins in the past, future, present, who see whatever seems endearing and alluring in terms of the world as inconstant, as stressful, as not self, as a disease, as a danger, they abandon craving. Those who abandon craving abandon acquisition. Those who abandon acquisition abandon stress. Those who abandon stress are released from birth, aging, death, sorrows, lamentations, pains, distresses, and despairs. They are released, I tell you, from suffering and stress. And that comes from SN 12:66. And when you read passages like this, right, it's easy to understand why so many would have much to dislike about Buddhism. You know, it really suggests that it can sound or feel like it's suggesting that the world is a diseased place, right? It's just it's not something to be clung to, right? And that can feel quite disconnected. It can feel quite dispassionate as it is, but not dispassionate perhaps in the way that the West feels comfortable with. So I am getting a little talked out, but I do want to take a moment. And again, before I speak to it, I just want to verify my thoughts on this, because I do have them, but I just want to make sure that, I remember this correctly. And then I'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the nuances of this passage, but also to not massage the truth out of it. Again, Buddhism isn't for everyone, and I'm certainly not going to sugarcoat what the Buddha actually taught. So I'll be right back, and we can kind of get into this very kind of thoughtful and, wow, seemingly very severe approach to looking at life. And so yes, yeah, just as I recalled, absolutely, the Buddha asked us to look at the world as diseased, burning with fire, afflicted. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So let me try to parse this out from my understanding of, what I'm reading here about what this meant in Buddhism. Okay, because where this can become quite nuanced is this is not in the way that perhaps maybe a religion that, kind of, this isn't, for instance, this isn't like sin in Christianity, okay, or other Judeo-Christian, possibly even Muslim, I don't know enough about these religions, the idea of sin, right? Man is the sinner, kind of born into sin. Unless, of course, you want to look at sin the way, the Greeks might, missing the mark. Then I guess then yeah, that would actually be similar to how, the Buddha looked at this idea of the world being diseased. So I realize it can sound like the Buddha suggesting that it's just this nasty, horrible, diseased place. He's using the word disease very sort of, he's talking about it more like dis-ease, that kind of disease. Not a parasite, not a virus, not a ball full of sinners all burning, needing to fight and beg and scramble for redemption or anything like that. It's dis-ease. So he wasn't saying that life is bad or the world is bad. Again, Buddha considered being born into a human body the best that phenomena arising can hope for. So, it's not like he didn't have deep, profound respect for Homo sapien, but he's suggesting that the world of experience and how we process those aggregates and how that pinball machine, both internally and externally, that captures us constantly, now more than ever, that is an affliction, depending on our relationship to it. And you can't get anywhere but shit from there. There's just not a whole lot of places to go from there that don't look like shit. So really for him, all he's suggesting here by this, is to recognize that just like our bodies can catch disease, influenza, colds, that this relationship of phenomena can also be diseased unless we train in our particular practice, right? So although it is often in the West confused with believing that the Buddha taught that we should be nihilistic, nothing could be further from the truth. That's just not true, fundamentally, of Buddhism. It is inaccurate. Speaking of accurate, he's not saying despise the world. He's saying to see it accurately, to see it for what it is. It's an encouragement. If you can't see it for what it is, then how do you know what the path is, right? If you have to be moored, or at least know where you're going, or how, you have to have some kind of context before you start to walk a path, so I think that's kind of the function here. Okay, I am done for this week, and woohoo! So next week, or it might be the week after that, lots of good things going on. Very grateful. When I can get to it as soon as I can, we'll start at the bottom of page 210, and we'll pick it up with the Sutta 118 as we continue along in chapter 3 in Right View, specifically looking at the property of space and really the crux of that, dependent co-arising. Thank you so much for listening, and I appreciate you. Take good care of yourself. Be well.